Greetings and welcome to Life Purpose by Design. Today I want to talk to you about a C word that is common to all of us, and that C word is clutter. I want to share with you the importance of making a decision to look at some of the randomness that we find in our personal lives, in other words, the non-essentials, and how do we trade in the randomness of our lives for a godly, ordered, kingdom purpose life. In other words, how do we walk out our faith in a life purposed by design instead of a life that's purposed by chaos? So today we want to talk about it's time to declutter your life. So where do we begin with the conversation? Let's start with some personal reflection questions. So as we look around us in our personal space, in our home space, in our maybe our work spaces, do you find yourselves asking the question, so where did all the stuff come from in the first place? Where did the stockpiles of, maybe it's a materialistic stockpile of things that you've collected over the years that you at some point saw the value and the worth and the treasure in it. And so you just kept it just in case you need it one day. But maybe our clutter is in our minds. Maybe it's our thoughts. Maybe we are experiencing sometimes that 101 woulda, coulda, shoulda type thoughts. You know, we're thinking about things either that has happened in the past, or we're thinking about things that we think may happen today or may happen in the future. And in the process, we find ourselves being cluttered mentally, physically, and spiritually. So today, let's talk about it's time to declutter your life. So where do we begin the conversation? With the questions that we just discussed. Personal reflections of examining our lives, examining our hearts, examining our minds, examining our personal space, and seeing what are the things that I'm just stockpiling around me that don't seem to have any significance to the kingdom purpose order for which God has called me. So let's look at the starting line of how do we get to the end goal in mind. And the end goal is how do we live a decluttered life that is purposed by God. So let's start at the starting line. Clutter. What is clutter? Clutter for us is anything that we have that's in our personal space, physically, in our personal space, mentally or spiritually, that really doesn't have any real significant value, but it's something that for whatever reason we're holding on to it. The bad part about clutter, or some of the drawbacks to clutter, is that clutter can lead us to being in a position of disorder, being in a place where we've filled some space with something that's not essential in place of something that is essential. So the essential things that God has purposed for our lives, the essential things that He wants to bring around us and surround us with, you know, are struggling to fit in because we have filled that space with those things that are non-essential. So to clutter something is to fill up that space with something that's not as important, doesn't have a intended use. But also clutter is a noun, which means it is a state of being, a state of thinking, that we think things in a random way versus in a kingdom ordered way. So when we clutter, we make a decision of disorganization in our lives. And you and I, that's not what we intended to do, but sometimes that's the end result. So clutter diminishes our capacity for growth because, again, it takes the place of something that actually has life, that has purpose, that have meaningfulness and usefulness in our lives. So I want us to look at the opposite of clutter, and that is to how do we declutter? What does that state of decluttering look like in our lives? So to declutter is to remove unnecessary items from an overcrowded place and to organize things in a meaningful and a useful way, in a meaningful state of being. In other words, it's a shift from a chaotic life of existence to a meaningful and purposeful existence. That the things that we have around us, the things that either materialistically or spiritually, the things that we think about, we can actually identify with a actual meaningful purpose for those things being in our lives. And so they're essential to our lives. So why is godly order so vital to us? I want us to look at an example in the Bible where God had purposed perfect order in the lives of two of his beloveds, but they made a decision to trade God's order for disorder. So I want us to think about the Garden of Eden experience in Genesis, which was a perfect place of paradise. Everything that God had put there had a meaningful purpose for Adam and Eve. However, he took every detail to take in consideration what their needs would be to live in this place of paradise, to live clutter-free, to eliminate any chaos that could possibly come up against what his intended purpose would be. But then we find in Genesis 3, 6 through 12, Adam and Eve decided that they had a better order of things for the place in which they found themselves. They decided that, this perfectly ordered place that God has given me is needing a renovation project. So they went into making some decisions that resulted in going from a place of order to a place of disorder. So when Adam and Eve decided to do their very own home cluttering project of the Garden of Eden, they made some changes. The first change they made is what they thought they should eat. In verse 6, the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, also desirable for gaining wisdom. So she took some of it and ate of it. And then she also gave it to her husband Adam. This is the same tree that God had told them not to eat off of. The second change of order is what they should wear. When they found themselves out of order with God's intended plan and purposes, they saw some things about themselves that God had not revealed to them. They saw themselves as being naked and otherwise missing something or lacking something or being exposed instead of being covered by the perfect order that God had given them. In verse 7, it says, then the eyes of both of them were open and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. They tried to cover up the things that God expected to be in the open and exposed because it was perfect. The third thing that they did was a change of order in where they should live. In verse 8, the man and the woman heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And they hid from God among the trees. So God had given them the entire garden, this whole place of paradise. But because they went from a place of perfect order to disorder, they decided instead of hanging out in paradise, they would hide out in the trees. And fourthly, their moving from a place of perfect order to disorder caused them to fall for the greatest distraction of all times. When Satan said to them, did God really say that you could not eat from the tree? And lied to them as the purpose for which God did not want them to partake of the tree. So in verse 11 and 12, he said, who told you, God says to them, who told you you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from? Then the woman says, okay, this is not my fault. The serpent told me to eat. And Adam was like, well, the woman told me to eat. So they were distracted into a place of disorder because they started to question about what did God really say. Adam's and Eve's disorderly thinking that they knew what was best led them to fall for the deception of the serpent and the lies that he told to them. So a life outside of God's perfect paradise had consequences for them. And when we live our lives